Welcome to the Living Wisdom Podcast. My name is Patrick Lee Miller. I'm a philosopher in Pittsburgh, and this podcast is going to be a philosophy podcast. And in this first season, I'm going to use the show Black Mirror to illustrate a number of philosophical ideas, just as I'm going to use philosophers and their writings to illuminate and deepen an appreciation of this philosophical show. So let me explain the title, Living Wisdom. I mean two things by it. First of all, living with wisdom, now in the 21st century. That is a term, wisdom, that one doesn't often hear in the academic discussions of philosophy, which are more often about knowledge or expertise. And although knowledge and expertise may be involved in wisdom and may not, wisdom is something else. And it's a word one finds more often used in the past, ancient wisdom, for example. But I think it's very much something we still need. So one aspect of the title is, what does it mean to live with wisdom now in the 21st century? The other meaning is that the wisdom of the past, I think, is still very much alive. And I mean not just the wisdom of the last century or the century before that, but the wisdom of antiquity. I'm going to talk about a lot of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, which is my specialty in the academy. But the podcast will be organized around Black Mirror episodes, about 15 of them. And for each one, I will have a conversation with somebody else about that particular Black Mirror episode. I have guests who are philosophers, of course, but also psychologists and people in related fields. And for each one of those episodes of my podcast, which is about a Black Mirror episode, there will be beforehand at least one, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 monologues by me, where I present philosophical ideas that I think help to understand that particular Black Mirror episode. Between the dialogues and the monologues, there are roughly 50 episodes of this first season of the Living Wisdom podcast. My producer, Perry Ganchuk, and I have been busy recording them for over a year now, and we will release 2 a week. So what is Black Mirror? Some of you will be fans of the show already, will have seen all of the episodes, will have seen some of them many times. But some of you will never have heard of the show at all. So I just want to say a few brief words to introduce the show. It started in 2011 on the BBC, where it ran for 2 seasons. The writer and often the producer is Charlie Brooker. It was then bought by Netflix in 2016, and it's had 3 seasons on that platform. The most recent, the 2019 season, had 5 episodes, and we can hope that it will continue into the future. It's an anthology, which is to say it's not got continuous characters, a continuous plot. Each episode stands alone. And there are minor references, very subtle hints between episodes about other episodes, as if they were all inhabiting the same world. But really, they're standalone shows. And now I'd like to talk in detail about particular Black Mirror episodes, and that, as a result, will involve spoilers. So if you don't want to hear about the many plot twists and surprises that occur in this series, then it would be a good time to stop this podcast and skip to the next episode if you're interested in continuing. Just to forecast, that next episode of my podcast will be about Plato's allegory of the cave, which I've chosen as the first substantial episode because I think that allegory and the ideas that Plato condenses into that allegory are the most helpful for understanding not just one particular Black Mirror episode, but most, if not all of them. And I'll hint that the 2 biggest ideas that Plato's allegory of the cave brings into the light are, first of all, the idea that what we take to be reality before we investigate it is not, in fact, real. So the idea of what's virtual and what's real is the central idea of Plato's allegory of the cave, and I think it's an idea that pops up in most of the Black Mirror episodes, as I'll discuss in detail in a moment. The other idea in Plato's allegory of the cave that I want to highlight is that of selfhood. The people who are trapped in the bottom of the cave, as I'll describe in the next episode, have been there their entire lives, and what they take to be real is in fact just a projection, a series of images, a movie on the wall of the cave, so that they are confused not only about what we would call external objects, but they're also confused about themselves. There are images of themselves that they take to be real that aren't in fact who they are. And I think that's a theme that occurs, again, in many of the Black Mirror episodes, or at least many of the ones that I find most interesting. So those two themes, what's real as opposed to what's an image, and secondly, who are we? Who are you, really? And combining those is a third theme. In the allegory of the cave, those prisoners trapped at the bottom who are mistaken not only about what's real, but also about who they really are, they achieve wisdom by coming out of the cave. They must first be liberated by a person who turns out to be an educator, a philosopher, and emerging from the cave into the light, they discover both who they really are and also what reality is like. So that third theme is, if it's the case that we are metaphorically born into the bottom of a cave, confused about what's real, confused about who we really are, what should we do? Plato's answer is education. What we should do is seek wisdom. And that starts with a love of wisdom. In Greek, philosophia is the love of wisdom. So much for Plato's Cave for now. If you're listening still, it's because you've already watched the show or you don't mind some of the details of the episodes being spoiled for you. So what is Black Mirror? The show has a certain essence, although it's very hard to describe. And the fact that it has an essence is testified by the fact that people who've watched this show, when certain things happen in their life, they'll say, oh, this should be a Black Mirror episode, or this could be a Black Mirror episode. And what is that exactly? So I myself have stepped back from these 50 episodes, these discussions, these monologues, and so on, and I've been thinking about what it is that makes Black Mirror Black Mirror, and here are my thoughts. First of all, people typically assume that the show is dark and dystopic, and that's the case for several, if not many, episodes. So 15 Million Merits, for example, is a dystopia where being like everybody else in that dystopia must ride a bicycle to generate electricity for a meaningless entertainment industry. He's trapped, just like the rest of them, and they're trapped by their belief about what reality is. Reality doesn't have to be like that. They're immersed in a cave. Or Men Against Fire, an episode about war where we have a bleak future where one civilization has eliminated or tried to eliminate from it everybody who has deficient DNA. Or Metalhead, a simple episode where these mechanical dogs, robots, are just out hunting people mindlessly. So those are typically dark episodes of Black Mirror. But the show is not always dark and dystopic. There are, in fact, some happy endings. For example, Nosedive. Yes, at the end of that show, Lacey, the main character, is in prison. She's been ostracized. She's stripped of her dress, even. But she's spiritually free for the first time in the entire show. She's smiling. She's joyous. And she might even be falling in love with the man with whom she's exchanging obscenities in that final scene. Another happy ending would be Hang the DJ, where the two lovers who've been separated are reunited and escape the system and live happily ever after. It's really a classic comedy in that sense. A more equivocal happy ending is that of Striking Vipers, where the two men who've been enjoying sex in the virtual space and causing troubles for them in the meat space or in their real life manage by the end of the show, with the cooperation of the wife of one of the men, to find an arrangement whereby all three of the members of that triangle are satisfied. Also equivocal is the happy ending of San Junipero. In the final scene, Yorkie and Kelly drive off to the beach in their Miata while Heaven is a Place on Earth plays in the background, and the affect is joyous. But I think the show invites us to imagine what the next day will be like, and the next day, and the next day, that they are there perhaps forever. And what will life be like for them in 1,000 years? So I don't think the show is dark and dystopic. There are episodes that match that description and episodes that don't. Another characterization people give of Black Mirror is that it's futuristic and technological. First of all, it's In some episodes, it is futuristic, but not all. In fact, there are several Black Mirror episodes that could happen now. For example, the first national anthem, where the prime minister is being blackmailed into having sex with a pig on national television in order to save the life of the princess. There's nothing technological about that episode. That could, as I say, happen now. So too, Shut Up and Dance, where Kenny has been caught watching pornography and filmed masturbating to it, and then is led into a deeper and deeper hole of crime because of, again, blackmail. There's nothing technological. There are no technologies in that episode that we don't already have. Next is the Waldo moment, where the Blue Bear candidate gets second place in that local election and then turns into a global political figure. Nothing in that episode that couldn't happen now. Smithereens, one of the recent episodes from 2019, where a man has lost his wife to a car accident that he caused because he was preoccupied with his phone. He contacts the head of the company, Smithereen, and there's a showdown at the end. There's nothing about that episode that's futuristic or technological at all. It could very much happen now. And finally, White Bear. We don't have Justice Parks, but we could. Whether we have electrodes or pills that eliminate memory from the day, I don't know. I suspect not. So perhaps that's starting to look towards the future. But already I've mentioned several episodes that could easily take place in the present. And in fact, there is a Black Mirror episode that takes place in the past, namely Bandersnatch. So if not dark, dystopic, futuristic, and technological, how should we characterize Black Mirror? I'd like to present 10 themes that I think the show continually returns to. The first three don't involve technology. They are freedom, degraded politics and culture, and shame, humiliation, and cruelty. So under the theme freedom, I think we can include Bandersnatch, which I just mentioned, where the main character is determined by, well, us as the viewers, because that's an interactive episode. Or Be Right Back, where the android appears and Martha is not satisfied with him, even though that android replicates many of the characteristics of the living Ash, who is now dead. He, their android, is not able to act as a free agent. He's simply following a program attuned to the characteristics of the living Ash, but it's not capable of improvisation and freedom. And finally, 15 Million Merits, which I've already mentioned, where we don't have cosmic determinism or the determinism of a robot, but we have a kind of political determination where these poor citizens are stuck, even to the extent that someone like Bing, who makes this heroic revolutionary gesture, nonetheless gets folded back into the system, as if it's impossible to assert one's freedom in that world. A second theme is degraded politics and culture, and 15 Million Merits makes a good example of that theme, where Charlie Brooker is, I think, criticizing capitalism, the way in which that economic order takes everything and turns it into a commodity, even the beautiful song of Abby, for example. Or National Anthem, which I've already mentioned as well, that has turned politics into a spectacle. So likewise with the Waldo moment, which is, among other things, a critique of democracy. When Jamie, the comedian behind the Blue Bear, is having a heated argument with his producer, the producer says, we've got a new kind of democracy where people can vote on their phones, thumbs up or thumbs down for any proposition, as if we don't need representatives any longer. And Jamie says, have you been on YouTube lately? What do people vote for on YouTube? And the producer is stymied, and Jamie says, the most popular video on YouTube is a dog farting the theme to Happy Days, and that's what it'll be tomorrow as well. So that's degraded politics and culture. Third of these themes that I've isolated is shame, humiliation, and cruelty. And again, the Waldo moment does a lot with shame. So Jamie is shamed by the politician. Jamie shames the conservative politician. Jamie shames the labor politician with whom he has the affair. National Anthem, again, is an episode that involves shame. The prime minister is humiliated when he has to have sex with a pig. Shut Up and Dance, it's shame and humiliation, or the fear of humiliation, that drives Kenny to commit crime after crime rather than have the video of him revealed. White Bear involves cruelty, obviously, and humiliation. So the punishment itself is cruel, but at the end of the day of punishment, Victoria is carried through the streets while people throw vegetables at her. An old-style public humiliation of a criminal. And finally, Hated in the Nation, where there is a death to hashtag, and people write death to so-and-so when they want to shame that person. And the person who has the most death to hashtags at the end of the day is then killed by these autonomous drone insects. That's, again, a public isolation of an individual who will become a scapegoat. Hated in the Nation is a good transition now to the next 7 themes. These first 3 themes that I've just mentioned, freedom, degraded politics, shame, humiliation, and cruelty, don't involve technology. And one of the things that Black Mirror is known for is its focus on technology. And I think that's legitimate. I've tried to emphasize that not every episode is technological, just as not every episode is dystopic or takes place in the future. But many of them do. And Hated in the Nation is an example where we don't yet have autonomous drone insects that can do quite what that show shows them doing. But we could. So what's going on in that show? Charlie Brooker has taken something that's already in us, namely the desire to humiliate other people, and especially the desire of a crowd to focus on one individual and cruelly humiliate that person. That's in us. That's been in our species as long as we know. But the episode Hated in the Nation takes a technology that really crystallizes that, and the person at the end of each day is killed by that technology. And this is a formula, I think, for many of the Black Mirror episodes. They take something that's ubiquitous, something that's in human nature, and then Charlie Brooker crafts a technology, one that we don't yet have, but easily could in the next 10 or 20 years, and in some cases, one that will never be invented, at least to my mind seems impossible. But the technology is, I think, incidental. I think the technology is just giving us a handy, dramatic device for focusing our attention on features of human nature. Now, there are several episodes where the technological innovation that plays this role is small. So Hated in the Nation is one of those. I think perhaps even now, but probably not far from now, there will be autonomous drone insects or something that could do that. Nosedive is another example where we don't yet have eye implants that give us a social media feed of everybody whom we encounter, although I did see a headline the other day that that technology now exists. So we're on the brink of something like that. But we already have social media. We already have preoccupation with likes. We already have people crafting their entire life around their public persona on Instagram and influencers and so on. So again, that technology is just pushing us a little farther than we already are. The entire history of you, we don't have eye implants that, or grains as they're called, that record all of our memories. But a little further in the future, perhaps we could, at least recording the visual and auditory stimulation that we get. And finally, in this category, I would include Archangel, where parents don't yet have the technology where they can filter out what their children see so that their children don't experience anything stressful. But perhaps we could. And I think it's certainly possible now to have devices in parents' hands that, with an implant in the child, would give the parent a constant feed of the metabolic signals of the child. So again, Archangel technology doesn't exist yet, or if it does, it's not being used to those purposes, but we're not far from that. And there's another category that I'd call intermediate technological innovations. Be Right Back, Striking Vipers, San Junipero, Playtest, Crocodile, Hang the DJ. These are episodes, I won't go into detail with each one of them, but these are episodes where I think the technology that's being imagined is perhaps in the distant future, but perhaps possible. So what can I say? Playtest, an episode in which the hero or the protagonist, Cooper, has an implant installed in his brain that is able to access his most fearful thoughts and give him a simulated experience of those thoughts and those fears coming alive. Well, we're not even close to doing that, but it seems at least logically possible. And a third category of technological innovations, I would say the big, frankly, impossible ones. And the USS Callister would be an example of this, where whole personalities are recreated from the DNA in saliva. I don't think you're going to get... If you got the body of somebody from the DNA in the saliva, that would be one thing. But the characters that are reproduced in that fantasy, the Star Trek fantasy, are the same people as the real people they're imitating. And I think that's a confusion about mind and body. So too for White Christmas or Black Museum, where whole subjectivities are reproduced in a virtual world. And that's true also, I suppose, of San Junipero. When people die, somehow their subjectivity continues. It's one thing to go into a virtual world as a real person, such as happens in Striking Vipers. I mean, we do that already when we play games. We play virtual games, we have avatars, and so on. But Striking Vipers takes that to the next step, where you go into that virtual world and you have bodily sensations. It's another thing entirely to have not a real person playing a game in a virtual world, but having that real person transferred into the game or the virtual world, so that there is no longer the real embodied person. There's simply the subjectivity of that real person in the virtual world. I think that works dramatically, but I think a moment's reflection will show that that's a confusion. Okay, well, anyway, my point here has been to say there are many Black Mirror episodes where there are technological innovations, whether small, intermediate, or big. And now I want to talk about the 7 themes that I see these technological innovations eliciting. First, technology and politics. Hated in the Nation, which I've already mentioned, is using those autonomous drone insects to focus our mind on the surveillance state, which, of course, we already have, which we've always had to some extent, and we're getting in bolder and bolder forms, especially in China right now. The philosophical question being, of course, whether the security we gain, or ostensibly gain, from that surveillance is worth the sacrifice of liberty that we must make. Now, clearly, the Chinese are willing to make that sacrifice, but in the United States and many Western countries, but I would say especially the United States, there's a real resistance against surrendering that liberty for the sake of security. Another tech and politics episode would be Men Against Fire, where the soldiers imagined in that episode are much more efficient at killing people because they're given eye implants that cast those enemies not as human beings, but as roaches. Might psychological technologies like this one make soldiers more efficient? And the psychiatrist in that episode tells a story about how soldiers oftentimes don't fire their weapons in war because of their moral scruples, and that to become truly efficient, an army needs to overcome not just the physical obstacles and have superior weaponry, but it has to also overcome the psychological obstacles that prevent people from killing each other. So that's the first of these tech themes, tech and politics. The second would be tech and gender, sex, and love. So I've spoken about Striking Vipers already, where this technology of going into the virtual world, not just as a fantasy, the way we do now with online games, but going in with bodily sensations. That allows the man to go in and play a female character, not only imagine what it's like to be a female in sex, but to actually experience sex from the female point of view. Or Hang the DJ, where the emphasis is not so much on sex as on love. This app that we find out is being used at the end of the film allows these two people who merely see each other in a bar to determine how compatible they are. Well, what does the app do? Apparently, it somehow, we're not shown in this episode, but it extracts their characters, maybe in the way that we've been shown more explicitly in other episodes, such as White Christmas, it extracts their characters and then has those characters interact in a virtual world, with the idea being that in that simulation, it could be determined that two people are 99.8% compatible, for example. And so what we have is the old fantasy, as I'll talk about in the podcast, from Aristophanes, that each of us has another half, the one for us, the romantic myth. Hang the DJs giving us a technological version of that myth. And finally, San Junipero under this theme, where Kelly and Yorkie are able to find love eternal in the town of San Junipero, in the program of San Junipero. But that raises the question of whether love eternal is possible. In other words, even if their identities could be kept alive, their psychologies kept alive forever, would love be sustainable forever? That's the question of, well, what do they do tomorrow? What do they do in 10,000 years? What do they do in 1,000,000 years? The third of these tech themes that I've isolated is tech and virtuality, or tech and the imagination. So Striking Vipers, for the reasons I've already mentioned, San Junipero, likewise, and finally Playtest. The fourth of these tech themes is tech and reality. So this is obviously related to tech and virtuality. But under tech and reality, I would include Archangel, where there's a real event like a dog barking, and the child doesn't get the real event, but instead gets the real event filtered through the Archangel device. So there is how important is reality unvarnished in parenting? Or can trauma be prevented by filtering experiences? Nosedive next is an episode like Archangel, where there are implants of some sort that filter reality. For example, at the end of the episode, we see dust in the prison, and it seems that Lacey's seeing dust for the first time. Her eye implants have filtered out the dust, and I think that's symbolic of all kinds of things that those eye implants are filtering out. They're also forcing her and everybody else in that society to see reality as filtered through social status. And social status itself is a kind of filter. And finally, under this theme of tech and reality, eye filters, especially as changing our perceptions of reality, would be Men Against Fire, where the eye filters are making human beings appear as cockroaches. Does changing our perception of reality, can it make us more cruel? That's the point of those eye filters. And is that the case? Is our cruelty susceptible to manipulation by the manipulation of our perception of reality? Another tech category would be tech and memory. So one of these episodes is The Entire History of You, where the grain implanted in the neck is recording everything that we see and hear and can be replayed. So we get a literal record of our life, the entire history of ourselves. The question of that episode, however, is how do we take up our memories? Do we take them up? Do we use them in an obsessive, suspicious, paranoid way, such as Liam does? Or are there healthy ways to access a complete record of your life? Crocodile is similar in that it focuses on memories as records, although there isn't a grain in Crocodile that's making the records. The idea is our brains are making records, and the device that the insurance agent is using can tap into our brains and get a replay of everything that we've experienced. That presupposes that our brains are indeed recording everything that we experience, as if memories are like grooves in records that are set there and can be replayed. Perhaps that's not how memory works. White Bear, finally, under this category, is about memory, among other things, because Victoria's memory of her day of torture is erased at the end of every day. And that's crucial, because if she were to wake up remembering what had happened to her the previous day, she wouldn't be taken in by the drama of the hunters and so on that terrorize her in the punishment. So she's living a life without memory, and that is her punishment. Is it true that living a life without memory would be itself a kind of punishment, and can we escape a certain kind of punishment through remembering in the right way? Those are questions that I'll discuss when we get to that episode. Now, two big categories left when it comes to tech and a theme. The first of these is what I'll call tech and personal identity. There are several episodes where an artificial intelligence is reproducing a person. So in Be Right Back, as I've mentioned, there's an android that's reproducing Ash. Or White Christmas, where cookies are extracted from people's brains, whatever a cookie is. I mean, there's some kind of information that's being extracted from people's brains and then instantiated into what's called a cookie. That idea gets used over and over again in USS Callister and in Black Museum, and perhaps even San Junipero. Again, aside from USS Callister, where the information that's used to create anew these artificial intelligences is from the DNA, the others, I think, all involve some kind of brain extraction of information from people's brains, their memories, their attitudes, or whatever, and that those are then replicated in artificial things, like in the Black Museum, a man who's replicated inside of a keychain and executed over and over again. Or in San Junipero, as I've mentioned, where the subjectivities of both Kelly and Yorkie upon their death are reproduced in the Tucker Industries computer. Well, all of these raise the question of whether those cookies or the android are indeed ourselves. Well, so that raises the question, well, who are we exactly? And there are theories that we are simply our memories, so that if it were possible to replicate our memories in an artificial device, that would then be us. But is that indeed an accurate view of who we are? And that brings me to the final big theme that I want to talk about in this show, and that is tech and selfhood more broadly, or authenticity. So take, again, Be Right Back, where the android has his characteristics because of what has been culled from his public self, from the emails that he wrote to people, from presumably his Facebook profile. And that raises the question of, is there a difference between the self that we present to other people, the self that we enact in our deeds, our public deeds, versus a private self, perhaps even a self that we never express? In Hang the DJ, we're not given an account of how it is that these two real people who see each other in the bar are reproduced inside the app that's going to determine whether or not they're compatible. But let's assume it works something like the other episodes, which are more explicit about that their social media records or their emails or maybe filling out a questionnaire, that their personality is recreated upon the basis of that kind of information. Well, is that kind of information you, or is there something about you that can't be replicated in information? If that were the case, then that app would be impossible. Any compatibility that were found between two people, if it's based on just that information, it's not finding out whether you, whoever you are below that information, is compatible. What about Striking Vipers, where these two men meet in this virtual world, one of whom, as I've mentioned, enters that world as a woman, and they enjoy a passionate sexual affair in the virtual world. It then becomes crucial to the episode that they meet in reality, in the meet space. And when they do, and when they kiss, there's nothing. They both say, there's nothing. So in reality, we typically say, and I guess I'm careful to say the meat space because I don't want to beg the question about what reality is, but in their bodies, when they meet in an embodied form, there is no passion. When they meet in the virtual space and one of them is recreated as a woman, then there's passion. Well, which is the real encounter? Is it that when we encounter each other as bodies, that's who we really are? And this is why I don't want to beg the question about what's real, but that's how we typically talk. How about when they meet in the virtual space, that's more real? Somehow that's getting to something deeper in them that they're not able to experience in the meet space. Well, that's a question. Then the Waldo moment. Jamie is the creator of the Blue Bear, and he has this ambivalent relationship with his character. So that character is getting a lot of praise, and when it's praised, he wants to say, but that's not me. Just because they love the Blue Bear doesn't mean that they love me. So he distinguishes himself from the Blue Bear. But then when he gives up and doesn't want to do the Blue Bear because he's disgusted with the role that's starting to play in the political life of the episode, he doesn't like it that somebody else is taking it over, as if it's his. Not just that it's his property, but that it's his character. So when we make things? Let's say when we write a poem, is it that there's an us that then produces something different from us, in this case the poem or the blue bear? Or is it instead that our creations, our deeds, our acts, those are us, that there isn't a deep us that gets expressed, but the who we are is there for everyone to see, whether it's a blue bear or a poem or a heroic deed or perhaps a crime? Finally, 2 episodes that I think dramatize this set of questions really about selfhood and authenticity are White Christmas and Nosedive. In White Christmas, a couple of characters in different ways experience something akin to solitary confinement. And in that isolation from everybody, they can't be who they are. They need to be in a relationship with other people in order to be who they are. By contrast, Nosedive, it's very romantic in the sense that society corrupts us. And in this case, we see quite explicitly how it is that society corrupts us is through the preoccupation with status that those eye implants foster in everybody. You can only become yourself in that episode when you detach completely from society, even to the point of being put in prison, such as Lacey is, and having that eye implant removed. And that's why I think White Christmas and Nosedive really tell 2 different stories about selfhood and authenticity. In the first case, we become who we are through our relationships with other people. In the second case, we become who we are by escaping our relationships with other people. So that's a lot of detail. I think only the true Black Mirror fanatic will have followed me through all of that, but I hope that some of it at least will interest you to listen to the detailed podcast that I do about these episodes. But let me just summarize succinctly then these themes that I think characterize Black Mirror. The first 3, freedom, degraded politics, shame, humiliation, cruelty, I set those off from the other 7 because these 3 don't involve technologies. The other 7 do, and so if I'm pushed, if I'm shoved, and I have to say, what is Black Mirror really about? Even though it doesn't cover all the episodes, I would say it's technological innovations that highlight aspects of human nature, aspects that are not created by these technologies, but that have been there all along. And that's one reason why I talk so much in this podcast about ancient philosophers, because they're obviously philosophizing long before these technologies are invented or even imagined, but they're talking about the very things, for example, our preoccupation with status, that these technological innovations that Charlie Brooker imagines highlight. I said that these technological innovations were of 3 sorts. Some were small and it could be done now or in the very near future. Some were big and we can imagine it happening in decades or in centuries. And then others, it seems to me at least, are impossible. But in any case, there are 7 themes that I isolate when it comes to these technological innovations. And they are tech and politics, tech and gender, sex, and love, tech and virtuality or imagination, tech and reality, especially eye filters, tech and memory, tech and personal identity, these cookies or copies, these artificial selves, and finally, tech and selfhood and authenticity. So stepping all the way back from that, what are the main questions that I'm going to investigate in this podcast, both in the lectures, the monologues that I give about particular philosophers, but also in the conversations that I have with other philosophers and psychologists and so on about these episodes? I think there are 3 big questions that I just keep coming back to, and that that could be my own preoccupations, but I think also these are the preoccupations of this show, Black Mirror. And they are, as I've just come from discussing, who are we? Are we our memories, our deeds, or is there something below that, call it, if you like, our soul, or our true self, that produces those memories and those deeds, so that even if you were to replicate the memories and the deeds, you couldn't replicate the thing that is below them. That's who you really are. That's a big question that's going to pop up in a lot of the episodes and also a lot of the philosophers that I present. The second big question is, what is real? Are our virtual worlds as real as our so-called real one? And finally, putting those 2 questions together, as I have already claimed happens in Plato's cave, when you decide who you are, when you decide what's real, how should you take those answers up in your life? How should you relate, especially to other people, knowing who you are, knowing what reality is really like, how should you relate to them? In love, in work, in politics, and in one case even in war. So Charlie Brooker's not a philosopher, as far as I know. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Black Mirror as a show is an anthology. There's no continuous plot. There are no continuous characters. But the show does, I think, keep coming back to these questions. And I'm going to begin this podcast with a description of Plato's allegory of the cave, as I anticipated earlier, because I think that story and the Platonic ideas that are condensed into that story give answers to those very questions that I think explain or deepen our understanding of these Black Mirror episodes. So just quickly, to anticipate the cave again, being born into a cave, these people are living in a virtual world. And if they're like us, as Socrates says in that story, then we too are born into a virtual world. This world that we call real, the embodied world that I mentioned earlier when I was discussing striking vipers, for example, is itself a virtual world. And that the selves that we think are ourselves, our deeds, our memories, what people say of us, our status, our relationships with other people that are implicated with all those other things, that those are images of ourselves, that those are not us. They are produced by us. We have a very intimate relationship with them, so that if you were to take those things and reproduce them and instantiate them in an artificial intelligence, you would have a simulacrum of us, an imitation of us. But it wouldn't in fact be us, because that simulacrum, that artificial intelligence, wouldn't be recreating the thing that's truly us, that's producing those deeds, those memories, those relationships, that status. And finally, in Plato's cave, an answer is given to the question, what should you do with an appreciation of the fact that you're born into a virtual world and that who you thought you were is not in fact who you are? And the answer Plato gives, that he inscribes into that story, is education, which particularly means for him philosophy, because philosophy will acquaint you both with reality and the reality of who you are. And that philosophy is not simply a set of doctrines, even a set of true doctrines that are given from teacher to student in a dogmatic manner, because that philosophy has to involve a critical engagement with the reasoning that has produced those doctrines. But neither is that philosophy the critical thinking, as it's called, an expertise and logical argumentation that moves one from one belief to another through valid reasoning. Nor, finally, is it an accumulation of knowledge about the history of thinkers and their relationships between periods and so on. None of what I'm saying is to disparage those things. It's important to have, I think, true doctrines. It's important to be able to argue logically and avoid fallacies. And I think it's important to acquire some familiarity with the history of thought. But that philosophy that Plato's talking about is the love of wisdom, philosophia. And crucially, that wisdom can't be dead. It can't be something inert in a book or even in a recording. That philosophy has to be something living. So welcome to the Living Wisdom podcast.